Hello and welcome everyone to this Devex conference call on how to communicate on gender. My name is Karina Mahumaza and I'm the Associate Director of Communications here at Devex. Thank you for joining from all over the world on this Friday morning or afternoon and evening, depending on where you're joining us from. I'm joining from the Devex office here in Washington, D.C. I'm excited to be speaking with our guests today, Sarah Lagat-Odwang and Susan Kren. Sarah previously worked as a communications specialist and business development specialist for Management Sciences for Health and worked in Uganda. Sarah's zeal for development and humanitarian work stems from a lived experience in formerly conflict-ridden northern Uganda. Susan is the Executive Director at Johns Hopkins Center for Communications Programs. Susan brings more than 30 years of expertise in implementing health communication programs for family planning, reproductive health, and more. Before we get started, I'd like to share some housekeeping information. We will be taking questions, so please submit them in the Q&A widget throughout the call. If you're having any technical difficulties, you can submit them there, and our technical team will also assist you. And now, on to our discussion. Welcome, Sarah and Susan. Exciting to be speaking with you all both this morning. So our team here at Devex is, yes, welcome. So our team here at Devex is still coming off of a high of Women Deliver, the world's largest gathering on gender equality. Our team came back here excited to work even harder for progress for women and girls around the world. So this is a timely conversation for us and hopefully for each of you that are listening. Let's get into the questions. So I'd love for Sarah and Susan to give us both a brief history of gender communications. What has changed in recent years, and are there any pivotal moments that you can remember a shift in how we talked about gender in the aid sector? Sarah, I'd love if you could start us off.
Well, thank you, Karine. Yes, for me personally, I think that a few of the pivotal moments that we've seen in the most recent past is the Me Too movement, but also the conversations of gender in regards to the humanitarian and development sector with Oxfam, with More Than Me in Liberia, and how we as the aid industry have categorically swept sexual violence and abuse in the aid industry, but also Me Too has given us a platform to be able to openly discuss issues of discrimination against women, issues of abuse against women, issues of sexual and coercive control over both women and men. And in gender comms, primarily in the context of Uganda and Sub-Saharan Africa, which I'm more familiar with, our messaging and our content and our targeting has been primarily focused on women and girls. And we do know that women and girls are proportionately affected by issues of sexual and gender-based violence and gender disparities. And that's where the messaging and the focusing has been. But in the recent past also, there's been more concerted effort to include men and boys in the conversation, men and boys as allies, but then men and boys also as victims of violence. And also in some instances, men have also experienced disparities in certain contexts. And so the conversation is shifting in that sense in Uganda in the sub-Saharan context, in sub-Saharan African context, from just, like throwing a spotlight on women and girls into including men and boys in the discussion as allies in the fight to mitigate the gender disparities that exist, but also tackling issues that are faced by men. For example, in Uganda, we're hosting over 1.5 million refugees, and many of the refugees that are coming into Uganda and in situations of recovery and rebuilding in post-conflict northern Uganda have been victims of sexual violence in the rebellion perpetrated by Joseph Konya's Lord's Resistance Army. And the humanitarian and development responders in the area have primarily neglected these categories of survivors, and they have been, just hidden under the rug by society and by aid agencies and the government. But now there's a more concerted effort to include them in the discussion. How do we help these categories of people, how do we then include them also in the programming that's targeting women and girls?
Susan, what would you add to that?
Yeah, thanks. I think just kind of stepping back a little bit on the broader perspective, totally agree with what's been said and shared. Just historically, I think that the gender challenges, dynamics have always been part of the focus in the reproductive health field, which is where a lot of our work grew out of. Thinking about the gender dynamics around decision-making, couple communication, gender norms, both male and female, and those have translated into a lot of other health sectors as well. Again, in terms of those pivotal moments, I think, as was mentioned, HIV certainly has been one of those. I think it forced us to look at the harmful masculinities that put men at risk of HIV, and that was also a turning point, I think, in bringing the conversation more around to the better inclusion of males and boys in general. And also, I think, as was said, highlighting the real inequitable dynamics around the control of sexuality and the inability to negotiate that sphere with condom use, et cetera, and putting women at risk. Just in general terms, I think gender integration and mainstreaming have been in place historically for many decades, but in the earlier times of these discussions, it was just harder to wrap your hands around something concrete, the real practical guidance around how to translate those concepts into actual implementation. And today, it's just a greater appreciation and understanding of how important it is to do this, and that without doing this, we're really not going to get to where we want to be and where we aspire to be on these issues. We have a much stronger, more robust and sophisticated perspective on how to do it. At the Women Deliver panel that I was part of just last week, the great tools that reference from going to from gender negative to gender transformative in communication initiatives. There are some terrific frameworks around masculinity and HIV, the reproductive empowerment framework. So there's a lot of great stuff happening, I think, to help us really kind of, again, reinforce this mainstreaming, if you will.
Yeah, definitely. And what I think one other thing, too, that a lot of what communicators are also experiencing and people in this space are experiencing is there's a lack of data on gender. What role does kind of data play in your abilities to be able to write messages about gender and write messages that are really resonating with people with data to back it up?
This is Susan. I'll jump in. I mean, I think that was one of the calls I heard at Women Deliver as well, is in order to really document, it's really critical to have the evidence to make the case to do the work. And so that data is absolutely essential around this issue. I think importantly as well, it's the big data, but it's also the information that's available in the local context and really using that to inform the programming on the ground. And that, of course, would be critical to what was mentioned in Uganda in that setting, and the specificity around the issues related to gender, whether that's gender violence or the reproductive health or other issues that, are impacting well-being. So I think grounding these initiatives and focus within the local context and the data and intelligence from that setting is absolutely critical.
I was just going to add that data is very important, especially in pushing for policy advocacy. And again, I'll just make a reference to Uganda. The leadership, especially in East Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, are usually more swayed when they see the extent of the problem. And so documenting data is very important in the sense that you have a tangible representation, like Susan mentioned earlier, you have a tangible representation to then say to the policymakers that, look, this is the problem, this is the urgency, and this is how we need to go about it. And so I think from my perspective, it's very important for policy, and it's very important to start conversations about topics that are not particularly culture friendly or particularly appropriate, and I use that term very loosely. So it helped to open those doors of conversation where it would be harder to deal with policy leaders and authorities.
Yeah, that's a great segue into the next question. What is unique to communicating about gender in different culture settings and within the aid framework? What should our listeners think about as they design messaging campaigns or even pamphlets or things to communicate for the different communities that they serve?
This is Susan again. I would say, each context is different, and it's really, again, critical to ground the communication interventions in that. And that means really doing the homework of formative work on the ground, listening to communities, understanding perceptions, facilitators, barriers to behavior, and really using the communities themselves to proffer solutions that they think are going to work in their context. One of the things we found in our work across many years is that in this space, the ability to have interventions that catalyze and engage discussion within communities and allow them to reflect and draw their conclusions are essential to really kind of changing and getting at the heart of some of these. And I think, again, that co-creation and pre-testing of interventions prior to scaling to ensure that they're really relevant and resonant is also critical.
Absolutely. Sarah, you've worked extensively through Uganda. Can you talk about some of your experiences there? I know that when we had chatted earlier, you talked about even in a place that like Uganda just has so many different languages and just throughout the different regions that you travel in. Can you talk a little bit about that experience?
Yes, absolutely. My experience in Uganda has been a bit broad in health communications and in democracy and governance, but primarily more in health communications. And I was working with Management Sciences for Health and supporting a number of USAID-funded projects that they were implementing, both nationally and within the regional projects. And in my experience, I found that different regions faced different gender issues, and it was not a one-size-fit-all communication strategy that you would use for any of the areas. The cultures are very different. They're also very dynamic. Culture is not static in the Ugandan context. In as much as there are over 60 tribes, each of them is speaking with different languages, a different way of life, different ways of expression. Their cultures are also constantly evolving. And so the communication strategies that we were using had to also constantly evolve to meet the dynamic nature of the ways of lives of the different communities that we worked with. But then also the other thing that I really found interesting was that even though I am Ugandan, even though I'm from a particular part of the country, and I thought that I had a contextual grasp of what was happening in my country, when I was working in the rural areas in eastern Uganda, I had to unlearn very many, their subconscious culture norms and values and biases that you have acquired in the course of your life. And so the way that you're communicating or the way that you're representing your organization can very much become a subjective thing, tying in your personal experiences, tying in your organizational values. But I quickly learned that I had to withdraw myself and remove myself from some of those issues and some of those things that I'd learned, and I had to unlearn them. And so I think that when we're talking about communicating to different cultures and people in different communities, it's very important to be aware of our own value systems, because sometimes we transcend them into the communications work that we do and the interventions that we create. And also to be very aware of the communities that we're in. And in particular, in Eastern Uganda, I was working with the strengthening, I was working with the STAR-E program, and it was primarily an intervention working in HIV and TB response. And in that particular context, I realized that in as much as our work was giving health education, was giving ART treatment, and we're giving maternal health and child services in different health centers, there were more needs that were not being met. And the one thing that I came to understand was that we need to tie in gender communications and our interventions to the basic needs of the communities. Is our interventions, is our communications meeting the material change in their circumstances? Our communications are more effective when we communicate directly to the needs that the communities have. Where are they? Where do they need to be? For most of the women in the rural communities, they want to know how, change in gender outliers, change in gender issues are going to directly affect their way of life. How is this going to affect the way that they relate with their husbands, with their communities? Is it going to be something that's going to benefit them in the long run? Are we communicating gender or are we communicating to gender? So I think that the one thing that I've learned with my work in Uganda is to take into cognizance the environment in which gender exists. The HIV, the poverty, the patriarchy. How do we marry our gender communications into those contexts in which gender exists? Because you cannot have the intervention separate from the environment. And so it very much affects how we're going to communicate to the people and how we'll be able to get them to buy into what we're doing.
Yes, absolutely. You make a really important point about how the gender really is very much cross-cutting with the other SDGs. And I think we're always looking, I think now the global development community is really always looking for where to kind of align more so than we have been before. But I think it's very important to kind of think about gender as that one SDG that really can cut across the other 16 SDGs as well. And it sounds like it's very much a constant learning and unlearning, especially as dialogue about certain issues that have been taboo are becoming less taboo, and development communicators really have to constantly adjust to that. I'd love to get to the next question. So this year, one of the takeaways from Women Deliver for our team as we debriefed was really thinking about the ways that the current gender dialogue needs to be more intersectional and also just all around more inclusive, as you both have mentioned. What are some practical ways to do this, and what are kind of the existing gaps on inclusivity from your perspective and where you guys both sit?
Yeah, I think, I'm quite optimistic about this. I think there's been a lot of progress here. There's a great deal more focus on gender dynamics, than ever. And I think people really do recognize that if we don't tackle some of these fundamental underlying issues to the other areas we're all working in, we're just not going to make the progress we'd like to. So there's, as we've mentioned, so much greater attention, not just to women and girls, but to men and boys as well. And I think that there's, again, so many great tools out there to really help with this work. So even helping organizations look at themselves. And I think, again, to echo the point that was just made, we really need to understand where we as individuals come from as we engage in this work. And there are tools to help organizations do this, look internally, as well as helping people think about their programming and how do we do a better job, whether you're working in agriculture or health or climate change or whatever the specific space is outside of gender. How do we bring these discussions and issues within the context of ongoing programming? And so, I think we're poised really to kind of take it away.
Sarah, would you have anything to add to that?
Yes. I think that we need to change the way we use language. Language, in my opinion, plays a critical role in how we interpret the world, including how we think and behave. And in the context of the work that we do as communications people, the specific language that we use in our official messages, be it press releases, social media content, the success stories we write, the publications, or even the statements from senior management that we use in our publicity affect, they play a critical role. The word choices often reflect unconscious assumptions about values, gender roles, and the abilities of men and women. And so we need to be cognizant of gendered language that we use in our interventions and in our day-to-day life. So I think that as communications people, we need to be very aware of the use of language. And then also, I think that it's important to ensure that both men and women are represented in our messaging. Both men and women should both be seen and heard and treated equally in our media products or in our communications products and messages. It's important to ensure that we have quotes from, men and women included in our messaging. And I would say that presenting, for example, female voices in traditionally male roles contributes to deconstructing stereotypes and gender roles and gender norms, and they can have a positive impact on people's attitudes over time. So I think that it's important to include both voices. So I would say that language, and ensuring the representation of both men and women in our messaging is important.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that's a really great answer. So we are about to move into kind of the Q&A portion. So if you are on the call and you have a question, I urge you to drop a question into the Q&A box, and we will be asking our presenters. There's a really great question that just came in, really that kind of tails off your points that you just made, Sarah. The question is, can you give us specific instances that need to be changed, instances of language that need to be changed? What are some of the biggest offenders?
Well, I've seen, for example, in certain instances where there's a country representative or a resident representative, and the immediate assumption is to think that they are male, and so the messaging will be like the country representative, he did this. And in many instances, some of them have been women or people in positions of leadership. So the assumptions or the use of language and pronouns like he, and assuming that a country representative cannot be a woman is a very mistaken misconception that needs to be addressed. So I think those particular representations are in those assumptions and stereotypes that we think that women are not able to do certain things and men are not able to do certain things.
And I do think this is, Susan, again, there is just a lot of that general reinforcement of the status quo that, men are in this role working outside the home, and rarely do you see the depiction of men, for instance, helping with the caregiving or doing the cooking or whatever it may be. So there's a lot of, you could kind of go across, the range of things you see in a given day and kind of pick out how, with some consciousness, you can see how these gender norms and stereotypes are reinforced. And with communication, you have the ability to role model different behaviors and to show that different side. And that's a very effective way to kind of, as was said, start changing the dynamic and get people thinking about these things a bit more consciously than we might ordinarily.
The next question is, can you be more specific about practices for incorporating intersectionality in contexts in which this quote unquote wave of feminism in the U.S. is less discussed? And there's a part 2 to this. Additionally, how can we be sure our communications are inclusive, but also that we are resourcing issues requiring such diverse priorities across disability, ethnicity, culture, sexual orientation, etc.? So the first part is about being specific about practices for intersectionality, and then making sure that communications are inclusive and including all those diverse priorities.
So there's a couple resources that we have that help with thinking about gender dynamics and how to integrate that in programming. There's a nice desk review from the core group that has key findings and recommendations across gender issues. Maybe after this call, we could both share some of those resources and tools that we know are available. And I think, again, the second part of this question really goes to that context discussion that we had and how critical and important it is to ensure that what we're doing is grounded in that context, because you can have general questions and guiding recommendations, but it then always needs to be individualized to that context.
Mm-hmm. I think what I would add to that is that I've been asking myself more lately what I envision as inclusivity, what the organizations that I've worked with have envisioned as inclusivity. I think that what we need to ask ourselves is that are the interventions that are the gender communications that we are already practicing or that we want to practice inclusive? Is it necessary to the communities that we're serving in terms of intersectionality? Do all the groups that we is this what they need? Is it what they want? Are they giving them what they need or what we think they need? I think that it's only when we can talk to them about what is affecting them and what they need. And like Susan mentioned, they are the ones that need to tell us what to do and how to communicate. I think we need to listen more to them, understand what they need and where they're coming from, and understand by their own definition and not ours. We need to ask the right questions. I think this will help us inform how we're going to be able to communicate in ways that are more inclusive. We need to listen more. We need to ask the right questions. We need to ask older groups of people, what do you want me to do for you? How can I help you? By listening and by asking the right questions, we're able to understand and to articulate and develop more inclusive interventions. And I think that it is us who need to be included in their conversations, in their communities, in their solutions, in their ways of life. It's us who need inclusion in those contexts. What is necessary for them cannot come from us. It must come from them. It's us who need to be included in their space. We need to be included to participate in a way that we can help to transcend their voices and to amplify their voices. But we must take a step back and ask what it is that they need. We need to listen and we need to ask the right questions and take a step back and just be participants and not the ones that are bringing the solutions to them. We need to be able to be the ones hearing and listening and taking note.
Absolutely. The next question is, how can we counter the perception that gender is part of a Western agenda and are Westerners, as defined by people in developing countries, hurting the cause by being overly visible in gender campaigns?
Well, I think it's important for, again, people locally to be the front face of these campaigns, for sure. But I do feel like the Westerners, donors, however you want to say that, external high visibility actors can be a supporting force, providing both technical and oftentimes financial resources. And outside of the local context, I do also feel that the global actors and alliances can also be a really useful, positive, force to support the local agendas as well. So I think there's a place and a space for, the Western voice, but it should not be, in my opinion, kind of in the front of a local agenda.
Just adding to what Susan is saying, I think that I like to always refer back to what Deng Xiaoping said. It doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice. I think that in my experience and in my particular work experience in Uganda, it's not, I would say that the partnerships, like Susan mentioned, there is a place for Westerners. There's a place for organizations that are typically based in the West to aid in the fight for gender equality. But I think that what the organizations need to ask themselves is, how local are they? And by local, I mean that are you adapted to the specific needs and priorities on the ground in those places where you're working? How congruent are you to those particular contexts? Local, in my opinion, is how fit to purpose your work is, or how fit to purpose you are. And so in that particular context, you need to be localized and to adapt to the specific needs and priorities on the ground. The people in the communities are always ready to embrace help, but help that comes in a way that respects who and what they are, and help that is relevant to their specific needs and priorities and the issues that they're facing in that particular time. I've seen many instances where we will take, for example, a health intervention somewhere, and we have a genuine we have a genuine intention and goodwill to go and transform the community, set up health centers, improve all these health indicators. But that's not the priority on the ground. The people in those places are hungry. There is drought. What they need is a food silo. What they need is a borehole dug there. And so the health center, while it's necessary, it's not meeting the immediate needs that they have at that particular time, and that is food security, and that is access to safe and clean water. And so we need to be, I think, Western organizations that are in this particular space need to just be able to adapt to the specific needs and priorities. But I think that communities are always ready to welcome them if they are able to adjust and to adapt to the way of life, but also including the communities in the design and in the discussions that are regarding issues affecting those particular communities that they're going to work in.
Thank you, Sarah. We have time for one more question. Unfortunately, we're running out of time on our call this morning. And so before we do our last question, I just want to, this will be the last question, and then we do have a lot of other questions that we will try to get to via email. So we'll be sending out a recording, and then also we'll try to have our speakers answer some of these questions. So don't fret. We'll make sure that we answer your questions, but we're going to only have time for one more question on this call this morning. So the last question is around storytelling and the influence of the West in the ways that we build and tell our stories. Is how can we tell stories in a way where our protagonists see themselves in the stories and narrative? Is there a way to do this, especially if you think about the storytelling that we're doing in rural communities? Is there a way that we can adapt the types of storytelling that we currently do in gender communications?
I think this is a very natural intersection. I wouldn't even pull it from the West. I think storytelling tradition is very common across the globe, and so it's a really nice way to kind of take advantage of local tradition and norms around the narrative and stories. And again, we've used stories and testimonials in some of the catalytic discussions supported through community interventions, and they're hugely powerful. So to me, it's an easy lift to go that way.
I do agree with Susan, and also I think that I would like to add, I think I worked on a maternal health radio program, and one of the things that we did was to incorporate traditional folklore and traditional music and song and art into the program that we designed, because it was relatable to the people. And so the storytelling, I think, should encompass part of their traditions and their way of life, and embed the stories in their culture in a way that they'll be able to understand and relate to it. And so I think that it is an easy thing to do if you have a grasp of the culture on the ground and the way of life of the people.
Absolutely. Well, unfortunately, we have come to the end of our scheduled time for this conference call, but I want to thank you all so much for joining us today. And we hope that you enjoyed the conversation. We know that it was short, and we got a lot of messages about that. So we see the questions and we'll answer them via email. And once you exit the call, a survey will appear in your browser. And if you can just take 2 minutes, we would really appreciate your feedback about this conference call and your ideas for future events. Many of you did mention that 30 minutes is too short for a conversation like this. So if you would like a longer time, please also mention that in the survey. That really helps our digital events team as we think about future events. And if you want to listen to the call again or share it with your colleagues, we'll be emailing it to you shortly and posting a recap on devex.com. So be on the lookout for that next week. Thank you again so much, Sarah and Susan, and have a lovely weekend.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.